In our last section, we ended with the French and Indian War, and after the French and Indian War to the Treaty of Paris, we saw that Britain ended up gaining a lot of land, but they also set this border along the Appalachian Mountains, which was the Proclamation of 1763, that pretty much forbade colonists from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains in order to try and avoid conflict with the Native Americans. However, a lot of colonists were angered by that proclamation. Many of them ignored the proclamation and continued to move westward and continued to encounter Native Americans along the westward front, that frontier. And because of this, Britain had a lot of trouble within the colonies after the French and Indian War. Because of all of the debt that they had after the war, all the costs of the war. They also had continual conflict, as this new territory meant constant conflict with the Native Americans. So Britain ended up sending an army, a standing army. So they had an army ready here in order to protect the colonists, in order to protect this newly acquired territory. And that cost money. You had the debt, and now you had how much money it cost to be able to supply this army, to pay for your soldiers. So Britain had to come up with a way to be able to afford all of this. So they decided to pay off the debts and maintain the army by raising taxes. And that was with the passing of the Sugar Act. And the Sugar Act really is the first act that raises money in the colonies in particular. And so there was these taxes that were placed on all kind of sugar and molasses products coming into the colonies. The British officials hoped that through the Sugar Act, they would be able to catch smugglers in the colonies. Many of these meant that the courts really had no juries any longer. If the Vice Admiralty courts, or those parliamentary officials who were here in the States, if they suspected smugglers, they were able to board the ships and contraband or take over all of those goods that were smuggled in without a warrant and without a trial. And so people here in the colonies, the colonists, really felt that their rights were being violated with the Sugar Act because they weren't really getting a fair trial, as the officials here were able to come in and start to contraband all of that sugar if they thought it was smuggled. So here we first begin to see the first acts of protest from the colonists through these acts that are being passed by Britain, because they first started to see and feel that their rights were being violated. And most importantly, because a lot of these acts, starting with the Sugar Act, all of these were passed by Parliament without the consent of the colonists. And the colonists now felt that they were no longer being treated as full English citizens that had representation in Parliament, but instead now were being treated as second-class citizens because they were being treated as subjects of the crown, that they didn't have any voice in the government, that they just had to follow the laws that were made for them, even without any kind of representation. So here we're first to start to see this hint of this whole idea of taxation without representation happening here in the colonies. One of the first people in the colonies to really outwardly protest what was going on with the passing of the Sugar Act was James Otis. He was a lawyer from Boston who claimed that Parliament didn't have the right to tax the colonists because of the fact that the colonists had not consented and did not participate in the creation of this act, of this law. Supporting James Otis and kind of writing on this idea was Samuel Adams, who was a very well-known businessman in Boston as well. And he was also the co-founder of what becomes known as the Sons of Liberty, who were these group of colonists who wanted to protest and boycott against the British. He also founded the Committees of Correspondence, which was also a group of people who began to write letters and sending them to different cities and different colonies, discussing what was going on in the colonies. And Samuel Adams is actually the one who coined the phrase "no taxation without representation." And so between these two, the colonists are going to start to grow in number with the feeling of resentment against Britain and the protests. In addition to the Sons of Liberty, we also have the establishment eventually of what's known as the Daughters of Liberty, of which these were the women in the colonies who began to urge Americans to use homemade clothes and household goods, not buy any kind of British imported goods, in order to boycott as well as a form of protest. And so between the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty, these two groups really are going to do a lot to rally people together to start to openly protest and boycott the British. In addition to the Sugar Act, we also had the passing of the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act meant that you had colonists who had to pay for an official stamp, right, or a seal every time they wanted to buy paper items, things like legal documents, licenses, newspapers, pamphlets, any playing cards, anything that was made out of paper. You needed to buy a stamp or seal along with that item. And this was actually the first act that was a direct tax on the individual colonists, not just on the colonies as a whole, but this was now taxing individual colonists, because if a person wanted to buy paper or any kind of paper product, they had to then pay this tax. Eventually, Parliament would have to repeal, right, or cancel this act, because a lot of the British merchants were starting to lose business as more and more people began to boycott and not buy any of their products. And so they were losing a lot of money. And so eventually Parliament had to repeal the Stamp Act. And we begin to see here the effect that the colonists and their boycotts and their protests are really having on the British Crown. Now, even though Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, they passed at the same time the Declaratory Act, which was really just reinforcing, Parliament wanted to reinforce the idea that they had the power to make the law for the colonies in all cases, no matter what the colonists protested and what they thought, they had the ultimate authority to make the law, and the colonies had to follow the law. That was the purpose of the Declaratory Act. It was just a way to reinforce that Parliament had ultimate authority in the colonies. They also passed later on a series of acts known as the Townshend Acts, and these placed taxes on things like glass, lead, paints, paper, and tea. So these were all very commonly used products. It also allowed for writs of assistance, which meant it was these kind of orders that tax collectors were able to search for smuggled goods without a warrant, right? They were able to board any ships that they thought might have smuggled goods. They were able to go and search for it without having to have a warrant. That was what the writs of assistance was. So one of these ships was the Liberty, that was owned by John Hancock, actually, and the British seized the ship. And this really angered the colonists, because now they really felt that with these writs of assistance, a lot of the rights that they felt they had as English citizens were being ignored. And so a lot of more boycotts began to emerge throughout Boston, right? This is all happening in Massachusetts. This is where it's first all beginning. So a lot of boycotts are happening in Massachusetts. Some of them are turning a little violent, and a lot of the tax collectors and British officials that were within Massachusetts were starting to fear for their safety and their lives. And a lot of people actually began to leave and go back to England in fear of what the angered colonists might have been capable of. So England actually ended up sending troops into Boston to try and keep the order and keep the peace. And of course, now tensions are very high between the colonists and the British officials and the British troops, right? And this is setting the stage to what becomes the most well-known of these pre-revolutionary events that we're going to be discussing in our next segment.